the recording a little early, just so I can get the PowerPoint up, and it'll just be a moment. Okay, and if I could just get verbal confirmation just from one student. Can you hear me okay? Can you see my screen?
L- Loud and clear, sir.
Excellent, excellent. So yeah, again, we'll start in a minute here, but uh, basically what this PowerPoint's going to be all about is systematically approaching paragraphs, and this is going to come in handy for your Unit 7 essay. In fact, what I would recommend is pretty much. So I'm going to give you the PowerPoint for this as well, and when you download it after I give you feedback and everything for attending, just download it, and you can even print it off if you want. But the idea is to kind of keep it next to you while you write your Unit 7 essay, because I literally break down sentence by sentence how to write an effective introduction, the body paragraphs, the conclusion. Um, and I basically kind of outline it in such a way where it's almost impossible not to score high on the final paper as long as you kind of heed all the advice. There's going to be a couple things I talk about that relate to the Unit 3 feedback as well. A couple things that might stand out to you, like you'll be like, oh, signpost phrases, you talked about that in the feedback, or um, you'll see maintain an objective voice. Little tidbits here and there, annotations I left on some of the feedback that you might notice. Um, so just keep that stuff in mind. So it's 7:15. I'm going to go ahead and start here. Uh, Thank you again for joining. I appreciate your time. And like I said, this is going to be all about systematically approaching paragraph structures. And the reason why we want to do it systematically is because all of these paragraphs have a particular function to them. And they should function as they are designed, and they're not interchangeable. So the function and structure of an introduction is very different than a body paragraph, and a body paragraph is very different from introductions and conclusions. The underlying strategies underneath them are very similar, but a lot of the tactics will change, and we're going to talk all about that. But before we get into that, I just want to reiterate the importance of thesis statements and outlines, particularly the thesis statement formula, where you do the even though opposing point of view, my stance is nevertheless important because X, Y, and Z. I talked about this in Unit 2, so I'm not going to go into crazy depth here, but I just want to reiterate how important that is. It's so important that even with my 1302 students, so the class after this one, the English class that you would take after, I still teach this thesis statement for them, and I put it in their live lectures as well, because thesis statements and outlines are so important. So important. And creating a thesis statement with that built-in rebuttal component and that expansion of the X, Y, and Z is also super important. So don't overlook um, that particular detail. And then a quick refresher. So back in Unit 2, we looked at everything from a bird's eye view. So when it came to writing the paper itself, we didn't go much further than this. So if you recall, when we went through the stages of the writing process and we got to the drafting stage, this is pretty much what we talked about. Talked about the thesis statement. We talked about our X, Y, Z, and how everything always related back to the thesis statement. Then you have the conclusion. So that's the bird's eye view. That was kind of like looking at the forest. Well, today we're going to go in and we're going to look at the trees. We're going to look at the bark on the trees and break down each of these individually and show how you can build them in a very strong way. And then another important thing is we also talked about that football game analogy, and it still carries over into what I'm going to talk about here. And I'll remind you guys a couple times as we go, like, hey, this is the introduction. We're just in the pregame right now. We're not trying to score points yet. And then game time for those body paragraphs, that's when you have your star players on the field. You introduce all those outside sources, you bring in that evidence, and then you have that post game interview where it's like, hey, don't send your kicker onto the field 15 minutes after the game to try to score the game winning field goal because that's just crazy. So the football game analogy still rings true. The pregame, the post game, and of course the game in the middle. So moving on, we've got we're going to start with introductions, and we're going to talk about the strategy of an introduction. And after we talk about the underlying strategy, we're going to break it down into its simplest form. And then after that, I'm going to offer you guys tactical considerations that will help you form it and make it into your own. And I'm going to repeat that process for body paragraphs and conclusions. So we're going to talk about the strategies of each. We're going to break them down into simplest form. I'll give you a couple other, unique little things here and there to kind of complement what we're talking about. And then, of course, tactical considerations for everything as well. So the underlying strategy or the overarching strategy, however you want to think about it, of an introduction is pretty much the same for any college paper that you write. So it doesn't matter if you're writing an expository paper, argumentative paper, research proposal, um, anything that you write, it's going to kind of follow a similar strategy like this. These are kind of like the universal principles that just don't change. So you're always going to start off your essay with some sort of hook, something to pull your readers in. You don't want to start off with a sweepingly broad statement that really doesn't mean anything. You want to find a way that to capture your audience's attention and make them want to read what's to come. And then you have contextual building sentences where you start building a background or a tapestry of your topic so your readers can make sense of it. And of course, you're going to introduce that thesis statement and a summary of your main points, so your X, Y, and Z. And that will kind of set your paper in motion. It's going to provide that roadmap for you as a writer. So if you use that thesis statement formula, that's your roadmap. It gives you a clear objective of what you're going to try to accomplish in your paper. And it also helps your readers kind of understand what you're aiming at as well. So if we're going to break down an introduction into its simplest form, we could come up with something like this. And there's no hard and fast rule. This is just one example. I'm actually going to show an example on the next slide that I think is more effective. But you'll see that they're ultimately very similar. So sentence one, this is your hook. This doesn't change. Sentences 2 and 3, this is your contextual building sentences where you start building a backdrop to set your topic against, something that makes sense of it without, just jumping right into all the specifics. And then you're going to talk about what perspective you're ultimately going to argue, discuss a rebuttal, so some sort of alternative angle, opposing perspective, and then you're going to postulate your thesis. And this is important, sentence 5, because remember, back in Unit 2, in Stage 2, the researching phase, you want to research to find out, not research to prove. So by including a rebuttaling sentence, so some sort of opposing view in the introduction, you demonstrate early to your readers that you did your diligence and you understand a big picture understanding of your topic. So you know the opposing point of view just as well as you know your point of view. And that's the key, right? To becoming an objective, honest, incredible academic writer. You want to kind of showcase that, hey, I did all the research. I didn't just cherry pick evidence. And this is that alternative, and it's a little bit more in depth than the previous one, but really there's only one major difference between this particular uh, structure for an introduction and the previous one. And everything starts out the same. So you have that hook sentence, avoid those sweepingly broad statements that lack substance. That would be like your from the beginning of time type of sentence. You don't want to start an essay like that. You don't want to start with something that's just so obvious that it kind of turns readers away. Um, you have two contextual sentences, so you can start narrowing down your topic. You want your words to mean something. Again, don't be sweepingly broad. Um, and this is also not the time for uh, introducing very specific talking points in your strongest evidence. Again, that's kind of like burning out your star players in the pregame warmups, and then they get injured and they can't even do anything in the actual game. So save your strong evidence, save your playmakers for when it counts, which is in the body paragraphs. Um, and comparing this to the previous slide, we've got these two antagonistic sentences here, and we put them back to back. So in the previous one, we had like your perspective that you would argue, one antagonistic sentence, and then the thesis. So it's kind of like a volley. It's kind of like us, them, us. But in this one, you could think of it as almost like pulling back the rubber band of a slingshot. And the more you give the antagonistic sentences a little bit of weight and a little bit of momentum, you can hit them with that rebuttal, that even so lets go of that tension in that rubber band. And because you did two sentences, there's more tension there. So your rebuttal is going to be even stronger. So use that even so opposing point of view. Your stance is nevertheless important because X, Y, and Z. So that's a really key point and a reason why I like this particular introduction strategy better than the previous one. And it has to do with those antagonistic sentences. And again, this showcases to your readers that you did your diligence, you did your research, you know the opposing point of view just as well as you know your own. Some tactical considerations. So these are the things that you can use to just kind of turn a like a B introduction into an A introduction, right? So this could get you from uh, anywhere between a half a letter grade and a full letter grade higher by kind of going through these. So you can carefully that hook sentence. One thing that I notice a lot, especially with um, writers that have writer's block or writing anxiety, when you get that blank page in front of you and you have to start writing your essay, you're like, I just need to get anything onto the paper, anything to get me started, and you just start typing, and that's fine. If that's you, that's totally fine, but recognize it for what it is, and then go back when you uh, reread your paper, make a revision. So really take a look at that first sentence, and you'll notice when you do have that writer's block and that writing anxiety, and you don't know where to start, you often spin your wheels for that first sentence, maybe second sentence even. You're just spinning your wheels trying to get your ideas out, and then you start gaining traction. So oftentimes you'll notice that maybe it's your second or third sentence that is the real true hook sentence for your essay, as opposed to the first ones that you originally wrote. So that's a good revision tool to kind of keep in your toolbox. And I think a lot of you guys will find that quite helpful. And moving on, we've got that show your sources early, but don't go into depth yet. So just like I said before, you don't want to exhaust all your resources right in the introduction. Again, this isn't the time or place to start going into the nuances of your argument. This is the pregame show. This is the warm ups. This is the coin toss. We're not actually playing the game yet. Um, so don't go all out in the pregame warm up because then you're not going to have anything left for the game. So that's kind of important. It's okay to cite your sources, but just do so in a way where it's like just vague general introductions, like the star quarterback of my team is so and so, and the star quarterback of the opposition team is so and this is the particular strengths and the weaknesses. Don't go into anything super general yet because that's just not the time or place. I've mentioned this one quite a few times already. Give your opposition a fair voice. Just like I said in Unit 2, you don't want to be attacking the straw man. You don't want to be committing any logical fallacies. Just make sure that you don't present those one-sided topics or one-sided arguments and just beat up on the punching bag, because those are super boring and ineffective. You kind of want to create a volley of ideas where you have ideas in paragraphs bouncing back and forth between each other, and exploring that gray area where the best academic writing usually occurs in. And avoid signpost phrases. You probably saw me write about this in Unit 3 on some of your papers. So essentially, what a signpost phrase is, talking about something before you actually say it. And really, they're just super weak transitions. So the most common ones I see are in this essay, or I'm going to talk about, or this essay will discuss, this paper will postulate, or anything of that nature. Just get rid of them for the sake of concision. Because ultimately, what this does is it creates a super weak thesis statement. Because if you say in this essay, I'm going to talk about, you're basically using that in lieu of the thesis statement formula. And really, what you're doing is just postulating your stance. There's no rebuttal component. And maybe you put an X, Y, and Z at the end of this, maybe, but you're much more prone to writing a one-sided argument, a one-sided thesis, if you kick it off with one of these signpost phrases. So definitely don't make that error, because again, this is the difference between scoring in the level 4 versus the level 5 on the grading rubric when it comes to introduction writing. And between all of these, it could be the difference between scoring in level 3 versus level 5. So all of this is very important. The thesis statement formula, and specifically talking about your X, Y, and Z, this is more of an advanced concept, but it's something that I think you guys can benefit from now, especially before you progress into higher level courses. But when you're thinking about your research and you're conducting your research and you're building an argument, it's a good idea to think in all three tenses here. So we're going to think in the past, present, and future. And you really want to avoid fixating on just one of them, because if you do that, you're going to get tunnel vision and you're going to miss things that could also be quite important. So, for example, if you're doing all this forensic thinking about things of how they were in the past, and how things got a certain way, that's great. But you might be missing those real-time observations of what is happening right now. What are the statistics, the stats, the data right now? And then you also miss out on where are things trending, where are things aiming to be in the future, what is to come of this. So when you're thinking about your arguments, it's a good idea to kind of appeal to all of them in a very balanced approach, where you don't neglect any one of them, but you also don't fixate on any one of them. it's a good idea to have that wise mind, that, right in the middle, that perfect balance of where you can see all of them simultaneously, and you acknowledge them all at some point in your paper. Again, that's more of an advanced concept, but it could be something that you could use in your paper for Unit 7. Now, moving on to the body paragraphs. So, again, if we're looking at that football game metaphor, this is when we kick it off. This is when we start trying to, score points. We have offensive and defensive cycles here. Um, this is where the action takes place. This is where your outside sources can really shine. You could think of them as your playmakers that can help you get things done. So, what is the body paragraph? What is the overarching strategy? Essentially, it is an effective paragraph develops one main idea through a series of related sentences. So, just like a drive in football, you're going to have a series of related plays that help you get into scoring range and ultimately score points. A paragraph is the same thing. It's a series of sentences that slowly and methodically move your ideas towards a particular destination. And ultimately, the destination is to either inform, persuade. So, whatever the objective is in your paper, so for instance, an argumentative paper, the objective that you're moving towards would be um, persuading your audience and supporting your X, Y, or Z. You could think of that. So if you do that successfully, that's like scoring a touchdown. You drive down the field through a series of related plays and you score a touchdown. That's the goal. So the main idea is usually introduced in the first sentence of the paragraph. We refer to that as the topic sentence. Usually they're about 5 to 7 sentences long. This is not a hard and fast rule. I would say 5 is kind of the low end. You don't really want to go lower than 5, but you could go 10 sentences or more. The only thing that influences how long you can make a paragraph is that it has to relate back to that topic sentence. Because again, we're developing one main idea. So as long as those 10 sentences are all directly related to that one idea, there's no reason why you can't continue to have longer body paragraphs like that. However, when the topic starts shifting, that's the signal to break things off and create a new paragraph, right? Um, that's just kind of how the flow of those body paragraphs are structured. And then a paragraph structure, it's a good idea to kind of think of it as a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you could think of, this is where we started on the playing field, this is how far we got, and these are the points you scored at the end of the drive, um, if any, right? So that's kind of how you want to think about that, from a metaphorical standpoint. And then lastly, and most importantly, the paragraph should easily trace back to the thesis, just like when we look at that bird's eye view of all the paragraphs circling back to the thesis. Um, all your paragraphs should easily be related to it. And if they're not, then you're just going on a tangent, and you might not be meeting your ultimate objective. So, the anatomy of a body paragraph. We briefly talked about this in Unit 2. Um, but we only talked about it in terms of where we could put outside sources effectively. And we came to the conclusion that it's the middle. Somewhere in the middle is where you put those outside sources. But I'm going to go into way more depth here, a lot more depth, and we're going to break this down in detail. So, sentence one, that's your topic sentence. That's your X, Y, or Z. Sentence two is a contextual sentence. So you're building context surrounding your main point. Sentences three and four, this is the good stuff. So sentence three, This is the introduction of your outside sources, your outside evidence, your case studies, your OSHA regulations, whatever. So all your outside sources that you're going to introduce should come somewhere here in the middle. Um, but it's an illustration ultimately. You're illustrating your point. And after that, you're going to follow up that outside source with an explanation in your own words. Uh, and this functions because it functions to the effect that usually the illustrations by themselves are relevant, but not so relevant that they synthesize obviously with your subtopic or your thesis. So ultimately, this is a way you can provide clarity on your illustration in the context of your paragraph or your overall argument. And you can repeat this cycle here, this recursive loop between outside sources and explaining those outside sources as many times as you want. So that's what I mean by you could go 7, 8, 9, 10 sentences uh, in a body paragraph, and you'd be perfectly fine in doing so, as long as these illustrations and explanations, as long as these cycles remain relevant to your topic sentence, then you'll be perfectly okay. And then before you kind of just jump ship and abandon this paragraph, which a lot of students have the bad tendency to do, you want to create like a mini conclusion sentence for your thesis or for your topic sentence um, that synthesizes everything, wraps it up. It's a therefore, a thus, or a consequently, something that pulls everything together and makes sense of it back to that thesis. So if you look at these body paragraphs, and like I mentioned, it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end to it. And you can almost think of a body paragraph as like a mini essay in and of itself, where you have essentially a mini thesis statement, and then these mini supporting sentences, and then you have this mini conclusion. Um, and ultimately, that's how they're built, right? So you can rinse and repeat that over and over again, and it'll work just fine. But this is a lot of information, right? A lot of information. So there's a couple good strategies for you to keep in mind for when you're actually writing your paper and when you're in the heat of writing and you're like, oh, this body paragraph needs better structure and organization. What am I going to do? So if you need better organization and structure in your papers and you're like, how do I start this paragraph? How do I break it off? How do I introduce this evidence? Well, here are some strategies that can help. And there's a couple of them here. Maybe some of these will click better with you than others, but my hope and my goal is that one or two, or maybe all of them will stick, and you'll be able to use them in the future as well. So the first one is the simplest one, and this is the ICE method. So um, as you can see, this is a whole lot less information than the anatomy of a body paragraph that we talked about in the last slide. But the idea is the same. We've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what we do is we introduce our our topic. So it's our X, Y, or Z. It's our topic sentence. We introduce I for ICE. Then we're going to cite. So this is going to be that illustration, explanation of the illustration, recursive loop that we talked about on the previous slide. So this is where you have an outside source and then you follow it up. Outside source, follow it up. And then you can explain it and ultimately clarify it, connect it to your thesis, and kind of move on. So it's a fairly simple strategy to kind of keep in mind. And these other ones explain more or less the same idea, just in a slightly different way. So we have the sandwich method. And I like this one for a couple of reasons. So we've got a topic sentence, we've got a closing sentence, and then we got all the good meat and vegetables in the middle. So obviously you could think of it top bun, bottom of the bun, and then whatever kind of sandwich you want, that's how you make it in the middle. Um, so the topic sentence, that top bun, that's exactly what it is. That's your X, Y, or Z introducing that new idea. It has a clear connection to the thesis statement. And then once you establish that in the beginning, then you can transition and start introducing those outside sources. You can start providing details, examples, evidence, clarification of those particular sources that you integrate. And you can rinse and repeat that cycle as many times as you want. And then you have that closing sentence, the bottom of the bun, where you make a definitive statement, tie it back to the thesis, and then you can start transitioning. Now, just like sandwiches can be made in a variety of ways. You don't want to have low quality ingredients when it comes to building these paragraphs. And that's why I like the sandwich method, because you could be like, all right, I'm going to have nice top quality baker's bread, or maybe I'll say some nice homemade bread, and we're going to make it perfect. We're not going to settle for 2-day expired Walmart bread or anything like that that might have some mold on it or something, or something that's just so chock full of preservatives that it'll last the next 50 years, right? So the quality of these sentences also matter a lot, just like in a sandwich, just like the supporting sentences. You could have top quality, hand carved roast beef, or you could have a bunch of bologna, right? And which one would you rather have? What one would your audience rather have? Are you going to give them bologna, or are you going to give them, you know, savory meat, right? I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. Um, when you create these sentences and you create these arguments, you want to support them with high quality sources. You don't want to just settle for whatever you find just off Google. You don't want to just settle for that slimy, that what is that? The slimy uh, deli turkey that comes in those little packs. I'm not knocking on it, but I've had it before and it's not great. They made us eat that sometimes when I was in the Air Force in boot camp, and it was terrible. Those were some of the worst sandwiches ever. So don't serve me those kind of sandwiches when it comes to your body paragraphs. Build me something good. High quality ingredients, right? Now, moving on, we got the peel method. This one's a little bit more in depth, but basically everything's the same here. We've got the main point. So this is your topic sentence, your X, Y, or Z relates to the thesis. We got that evidence and explanation recursive loop here, where you build that context, introduce a connection to evidence, showcase the relevance of it, study statistics, facts. You rinse and repeat. You have this nice little recursive loop. Once things are, kind of running low on fumes there's not much left to talk about, or maybe you hit the wall and you're like, all right, time to transition. That's okay. Have that concluding statement, that mini conclusion sentence for that paragraph, and then start transitioning out. So, again, all of these are just meant for you guys to kind of, you know, piece together body paragraphs in your own way, in a way that makes sense for you. Because some of these click better for others. You might be like, the peel method, I have no idea what that is talking about, but the sandwich method clicks, right? Or maybe it's like, I don't know, the ice method works best for me, and that's the one I want to go with. So, again, these are just tools for your toolbox. Don't feel compelled to memorize any of this. It's just what clicks for you is what you should go for. Now, for my EMS and my fire folks, you might be familiar with the SOAP method. The SOAP method, if you're unfamiliar, stands for Subject Objective Assessment Plan. It's typically used for writing patient care reports. So, any sort of medical emergency, we have to write a medical narrative in our patient care reports. And the most commonly taught method is the SOAP method. And with a little bit of imagination and a little bit of creativity and tweaking, we can apply the SOAP method to body paragraph construction. Because at the end of the day, they're structured approaches to creating some sort of narrative. And depending on what you're talking about, it might work perfectly. And then other times you might be like, oh, that's kind of a stretch. I'm not sure how I'm going to piece that together. But if you have written a bunch of medical reports using the SOAP method, this could be a really good way to kind of segue into academic writing, um, you know, in a kind of meaningful way. You can use those skills and that muscle memory that you built up after so many years to kind of help you transition into this brave new world, right? So we have the subject. This is your topic sentence. You could think of that as your who or your where. You have the objective. So this clarifies actions related to the subject, right? So your how or your what. You have an assessment. Now, the caveat here. So EMS, medical, fire, you guys, we can't offer a diagnosis in the field because we're not doctors. We can't say, you can't pronounce someone's dead unless you have the proper, the proper credentials to do so. So, when it comes to academic writing, it's the complete opposite. So after you research your topic and you dig into the literature and you're presenting it in a paper such as this, um, you can offer an analysis, an evaluation, a judgment, a diagnosis in a sense. You can explain the why behind your subject and objective. You can discuss why. You can interpret. So that's a drastic difference from using the SOAP method in the field of medicine versus using it in the world of academic writing. You have a lot more freedom in the assessment aspect of writing papers. And then the plan, you could think of that again as your solution statement or that concluding statement where you wrap things up, tie it back to the thesis, and then you kind of move on. So far, so good, right? Not too bad. So here we're going to look at the art of transitions, achieving flow. Um, and there's a lot to unpack here. And I want to say it is definitely more of an art than a science, but you're going to see some things here that are going to really help you create more flow in your writing. And the way I kind of like to think of it is if you look at maybe your favorite movies, TV shows, favorite books, and you look at the structure of how things move, there's hardly any wasted movement. There's such a great conservation of energy in those stories. There's just very little wasted movement, and there's subtle transitions that make everything work. And all the little details have some sort of meaning and purpose behind them. And when you think about writing your essays, it's a good idea to think of trying to achieve that same kind of flow and conservation of energy in your writing. And it's going to take your writing from, where you are now to the next level by doing that. And again, a lot of it has to do with transition. So there's so much more than that. But the general concept here is establishing flow and having some sort of conservation of energy and also building this control over the movement of your ideas. Because oftentimes with new writers, you have good ideas, but you don't know how to control the movement of them just yet. So this is going to help you control it. Now, oftentimes, the transition out of a paragraph begins in the topic sentence of a new paragraph. And here are some examples here. So these very simple transitions here, even so. So if you kick off a paragraph with even so, your readers don't even need to read the rest of the sentence. They know it's going to be a rebuttal paragraph just from that first transition. So immediately you're already establishing flow into your paragraph, because what does this do? Even so, a rebuttal, it means whatever came before it, whatever body paragraph came before it, you're about to introduce a counter, some sort of counter argument. And that is basically volleying ideas back and forth. It's a offensive and defensive cycle, just like a football game. You have offensive and defensive cycles where one team has the ball, then the other team, and everyone's trying to score, right? And you're giving a fair voice to each perspective, and you're introducing all this evidence, and right. So even so helps signal to your readers in a way, hey, rebuttal is coming. Here's a different cycle. Though and still also function in that same way, where they offer a little bit of more wiggle room, because even so is like a really strong rebuttal. That's like a complete rebuttal. That means like everything you wrote about before, even so, and then it's just a complete 180. Still opens the door for like just an alternative perspective. It's like, here's my paragraph, but still you're kind of missing this part. So this is kind of like poking a hole. These are kind of like poking holes in the previous, whereas this one just flips it completely upside down. So very subtle difference, with totally different impacts. But again, these little transitions can make the difference between a paper that flows incredibly well versus one that just reads super choppy. Um, and again, if you don't have those rebuttal paragraphs, you can use likewise, furthermore. These are just, likewise is like having an ally. This is an ally to the previous paragraph. A furthermore, that's an advancement. That's like a reinforcement. Um, and they're not completely interchangeable, right? So likewise means it's similar. It's not the same. It's similar. It's an ally. Furthermore means it's the same, and we're building on it. So that's why I think of it as a reinforcement. Ally, reinforcement, strong rebuttal. And again, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of transitional words and phrases that you can use that help you build this transition in and out and between paragraphs. Um, and then we also have these transitions that we can use inside of paragraphs as well. And these ones are really interesting because, um, when you have the uh, illustration and explanation of illustration recursive loops that we were talking about, where it's you introduce an outside source, then you clarify that outside source. Well, you have an awesome list right here to kind of help you weave back and forth between them, volleying between them. That's kind of like, your bump set, bump set, bump set, and then all of a sudden you come to that concluding statement, and that's your spike. So the way I kind of like to think of it is you have this outside source that you're going to introduce. According to is the simplest one to remember. That's why I put it in red. Very easy to remember. So according to Smith, 2023, according to Jefferson, 2011, whatever, right? So you introduce that outside source, and then you clarify it, right? Because you have that illustration, explanation of the illustration. So in that follow-up sentence, you could say, in other words, and then you actually synthesize it with your topic sentence and synthesize it with your thesis statement. And you could use any of these, to explain, to clarify, to put another way. And you kind of bounce back and forth between these in your body paragraphs to help build flow within those paragraphs. So it's kind of like your bump, your set, bump, spike, or set. And then when you get ready to transition and conclude that particular paragraph, you can use one of these causation transitions where it's like a consequently or therefore. This is your spike. This is where it's like, boom, here's my definitive statement on this particular paragraph. Here's my touchdown that I'm about to score, or here's my field goal I'm about to kick. A therefore, a thus, a consequently. It just helps put points on the board and make it be known. And that's why these paragraphs are structured in this particular way. Now, if we're going to put this into just a random example here, you can see we have that introduction sentence here. You don't need to know any of this. You don't need to memorize any of this. None of it really matters. All I'm doing is showing you an example of, hey, here's your topic sentence, kicks things off. Here's a nice little transitional statement that builds context. A for instance, that builds context. And it's also a nice way to add outside research. And then you can get to your illustration, explanation. So here's another one that builds more evidence. And then when you have your concluding statement, so you have a bump, you have a set, and then you have a spike. Thus, boom, you lay it on the readers there, and then you can transition to the next paragraph. And with that next paragraph, it could be a rebuttal. It could be even though Bakhtin blah 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 blah, or even though Mandelker said blah blah blah, she is nevertheless missing this idea or this point or whatever. So these transitional words make a huge difference when it comes to establishing flow in a paragraph. Now, if we're going to look at some tactical considerations here, this is where you can really make your body paragraphs your own, and craft them in a way where they're effective for your particular purpose. And a lot of this stuff is going to be pretty obvious: statistics, facts, quotes, anecdotes. So if you're a natural born storyteller, you can tell your stories in a way that are more interesting. Definitely don't stifle your writing voice. You can still make it interesting and engaging, even if you have to, predominantly stay in an objective point of view. It just takes a little bit of practice using paradoxes, logic, avoiding those fallacies, of course, but you can definitely include them in your paper. Oh yeah, one thing I missed up here. So with statistics, if you find yourself using generalized terms like some, most, many, few, all, I would challenge you to find the research that proves it. Because usually we rely on those, they're called quantifiers. We don't want to rely on those existential qualifiers, because it often means that we're just assuming, like many, few. It's kind of like the lazy way of trying to put forth an argument without actually doing the research on it. Or maybe you're like, yeah, maybe it is a generalization and it is an accurate generalization, but how much more impactful would it be if you actually found a tangible number to put on it? Probably a lot more. It's the difference between saying a lot of people die from smoking related lung diseases every year versus 432,000 whatever people die each year from smoking related diseases. You know what I mean? So putting that actual statistic or fact onto it could essentially defamiliarize that idea to your readers, right? Just like if you were going to say, like, oh, yeah, a lot of people die in car accidents every year or whatever. That's fine and dandy. Most people know that. But maybe you could put it in a way where it makes it a little bit more shocking, a little bit more impactful, like every so and so seconds, somebody dies in a car accident, right? So that puts it in a totally different perspective where all of a sudden you take this kind of mundane fact or statistic and you present it in a way that is more persuasive. Um, and again, you can also use anecdotes in that same kind of way. All of this is meant to shed light on your topic, make your ideas more persuasive, uncover the truth, emphasize the truth, right? And problem statements down here at the bottom, this is really more of a stage two researching phase tool that you can eventually implement in your body paragraphs. I wouldn't recommend uh, doing this on the fly. This is something you probably have to plan out. Essentially, what it is, though, it's just reframing age old, dull, ineffective questions, um, and basically rewording them in a way where you can open up more doors, you can create some space, and start working with it. So, an example I like to use here is um, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life? This is a really, you know, tough question to answer because if thousands of years haven't produced an objective answer yet that everyone could agree upon universally, it's probably not going to be answered in a 5 paragraph essay. You know what I mean? It's just not going to happen. And there's no amount of research that you can do that will effectively argue that case anyway. Um, so, what you have to do is reframe it in a way where you get some wiggle room, where you can actually get an answer. Um, and, maybe you don't need the answer, but you can actually, just start asking more questions that might have more solutions or even subjective truths, right? So you can reframe it. So, what is the meaning of life? Let's ask instead, how can I live my life more meaningfully? How can I live my life more meaningfully? And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, I can actually provide an answer to that. And maybe my answer could persuade other people to think similarly, right? And maybe I could point to some evidence in my life that would be convincing, right? So we're starting to inch closer to what would be acceptable for an academic writing essay. We're not 100% there yet, but we're getting closer. And what you'd have to do is, really reframe things in a way where um, you you have to close some doors to open some new ones, right? Because you know, if you're going to answer what is the meaning of life and you change it to how can I live my life more meaningfully, yes, you do close the door to that previous question. However, think of all the new doors you just opened. And maybe these problem statements and reframing these questions, it could be something used in your workplace when you're trying to uncover problems or find a solution. You're trying to think outside the box. Maybe you keep running into a wall and you don't know where to turn or what to do. You can try this reframing tool where it's like, okay, well, let's ask a different question. Let's find a different question. Let's see what doors we can open, right? And that'll give you some space. It'll give you some room. Again, it might not lead you to the answer, but it might lead you to something meaningful, impactful, something that can inspire change uh, in your workplace or whatever, right? So moving on here, we got the conclusions. So the conclusions, the strategies are all pretty much the same for any conclusion that you write. And again, they function very differently than body paragraphs. Uh, Again, we got the football metaphor. We've got the conclusion is the post game interviews. So do not send your team onto the field 15 minutes after the game to try to kick the game winning field goal. The game is over at this point. Don't be a weirdo trying to score points when the game's over. That the conclusion is the post game interview. You're going to look at a couple highlights the key plays in the game, right? And you're going to talk about some strengths, weaknesses, opportunities for, the next week, areas where you need to shore up. Maybe there's some concerns. Maybe there's some areas where future research is needed, and maybe there's a gap in the literature, right? So, all of those kind of things come into play in the conclusion. So, we're going to recap that thesis. We're going to summarize those main points, those X, Y, and Z's, those highlights, right? Where your playmakers came in and, did the heavy lifting for you. Share some final thoughts and leave a lasting impression. Um, and in its simplest form, it's very similar to what was described on the previous slide. Revisiting the thesis, emphasizing the seriousness, talking about the key plays, the highlights, the calls for action and awareness, those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities for growth, some concerns that might need to be addressed. You could talk about solutions, but ultimately you want to leave the reader with a final thought that is impactful because uh, with learning, there's something called the law of recency, and the most recent thing that was said will hopefully have an impact on the reader and something that they would remember. So if you kick off a paper in a strong way that hooks them in, and then you leave them with a really strong final thought, readers are going to remember your essay. They're going to remember what you talked about. Maybe not everything, but they will remember that hook and they will remember that final impression. Some tactical considerations: avoid those signpost phrases. Just like I said earlier with the introductions, one of the worst things you could do is transition into a conclusion with in conclusion. Um, it's wise to omit any word or phrase from a sentence as long as it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. Again, we don't want that wasted energy. We want to conserve the energy. We want to establish that flow. We don't want anything extra or fluffy. Just like in your favorite movies, your favorite TV shows, your favorite books, you want everything to mean something. You want it to flow. And when you start adding in fluffy phrases that don't mean anything, that's when you're going to lose your readers. They're not going to want to stick around. They're going to be, oh, in conclusion. Oh, that's just another conclusion. You don't want to, dole your writing through that. And I know oftentimes it's a more of a signal that you use for yourself, like, okay, I'm going to write the conclusion now, so I'm going to write in conclusion. Um, and again, if that's you, if that's how you kick off your conclusion paragraphs, that's totally fine. However, just recognize it for what it is. Get rid of it when you revise your paper later on. Um, Avoid introducing new information. So this is what I mean by don't send your team onto the field to kick the game-winning field goal 15 minutes after the game's over and the other team's already given their press conference and your coach is wondering where the heck your team is. Yeah, don't introduce new information in the conclusion. It's not the time or place. The information should be in the body paragraphs where it functions best, where it can really and truly shine. Um, you don't want to, be walking down the tunnel after the game, still throwing haymakers at the opposing players. It's not the time or place for it. Conclusion is the post game interview. So don't commit that very, very common writing blunder. And maintaining an objective voice. I wrote this on quite a few papers in Unit 3. Essentially, don't write in the first or second person. Um, that's your I, me, my, you, your, our, we. Get rid of I believe, I think, I feel, in my opinion. Get rid of those completely from your vocabulary. Ultimately, what'll happen is if you think of your essay as like trying to survive on a boat, just a little inner tube, and the rough waters of your essay. Every time you use the first person or the second person, it's kind of like poking holes in the bottom of your inflatable tube there, and you're slowly going to sink your argument. Um, so at first, they don't seem like a big deal. It's just a pinhole in the argument, but over time, it will ultimately sink it. And then, of course, be concise. So 5 to 7 sentences. They don't need to be very lengthy or long. All you have to do is summarize your ideas and talk about those key highlights, talk about those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and then transition out. Leave them with a final impression. And that is the end. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask away. You can unmute your mics. And let's see. Any questions, guys? Anything at all? If you guys don't have questions, that's totally okay. You guys can send me an email. You guys can send me a message in class. Ultimately, what this entire PowerPoint was for, it's for your Unit 7 essay. And again, I would highly recommend after completing the thing where you say, I attended the live lecture, I'll send you the PowerPoint and the feedback. Print out that PowerPoint or just keep it handy when you write your Unit 7 essay and just kind of follow along those breakdowns and follow along those tactical considerations. I mean, it's a blueprint, basically start to finish, sentence by sentence, how to write a really, really high quality essay. And if you're kind of lost and you don't know where to go with it, that would be a great place to kind of start. And then just as a reminder, back in Unit 2, we talked a lot about the writing process from a bird's eye view, an abstract view. So ideally, that writing process that we talked about in Unit 2 should span several days, close to a week. So basically, your preliminary thinking starts now. Um, the preliminary thinking, stage one, starts as soon as you finish this lecture and you open up that Unit 7 essay and you start getting some ideas. And then wait a few days, you could get some research done, and then maybe by Monday next week, you could already have an outline and a thesis. And then that would leave you an entire week plus a few days to actually write the essay. So that's all I've got for you guys. That's all I've got. So you guys are free to go. And again, if you guys have any questions at all, I am here for you. All right, you guys have a good night.